The folder Patrice Holt slid across the desk was thin. Nora Callahan had learned long ago to read rooms by the weight of paper, and thin folders meant either very good news or very little of anything at all. This one was stapled in the upper left corner with a county seal she didn't recognize, and the label read Callahan, Nora M. Estate notification in a font so bureaucratic it almost didn't register as human language. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. She was 22 years old, and she had $312 in a checking account that had never seen a direct deposit. Everything she owned fit in 2 duffel bags and a cardboard box held together with 3 wraps of packing tape. The September air coming through Patrice's window smelled like old carpet and the particular sadness of buildings that housed too many people for too little time. Nora sat in the same plastic chair she had sat in at 16 and at 18 and at 20, different social workers each time. The same chair, the same county seal letterhead, the same conversation about her options. She had her hair in a plain braid down the center of her back, and her hands were rough from maintenance work, the knuckles scraped from where she'd caught them on a pipe fitting the previous week, and she was wearing the only jacket she owned, which was a dark green canvas barn coat she'd bought secondhand 3 winters ago and had repaired in 4 places since. She looked like what she was, a person who had learned to take care of things because no one else was going to. This came certified mail to our office because you're still on record as a ward at this address, Patrice said. She was a tired woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed to the top of her forehead and a coffee mug that said Monday is a mindset. I'm not sure what it means yet, but you should read it. Nora took the folder and read. The document was from the Harlan County Circuit Court, stamped and notarized and dense with language written by someone who believed that clarity was a liability. She read it 3 times before the central fact emerged from the legal undergrowth. A man named Thomas Francis Callahan had died in March of that year, leaving a will that named Nora Margaret Callahan as his sole heir. The estate consisted of a single parcel of land 40 acres in the upper reaches of Callahan Hollow, off Route 160 in Harlan County, along with whatever personal property remained on the premises. The property carried 2 years of unpaid tax assessments totaling $4,200, due within 90 days, or the county would begin foreclosure proceedings. There was a phone number for an attorney named Silas Pruitt, who had handled the estate filing. Nora read the name Thomas Francis Callahan again and felt nothing she could identify as recognition. Her mother had been Bridget Callahan, dead at 28 from an overdose in a motel room in Hazard when Nora was 3 years old. The state took Nora the same week. She had grown up in a series of foster placements and group homes across eastern Kentucky. Her childhood measured not in birthday cakes, but in caseworker handoffs and school transfers. She knew she was Irish somewhere back in the line. The last name was evidence enough, but family had never been a subject anyone offered her much detail about. When you grew up in state care, you learned quickly that questions about origins were rarely answered well, and that pressing them rarely made you popular with the adults who held the answers. She had clear memories from 2 of the 9 placements. A foster home in Letcher County where a woman named Doris kept a clean kitchen and let her borrow library books without making it feel like a privilege being extended. A group facility in Whitesburg where a teacher named Mr. Ferber had told her she had an engineering mind, which was the nicest thing any adult had ever said to her, and which she had turned over in her hands many times since. The way you turned over a coin you weren't sure was real. She could hold spatial relationships in her head with unusual precision, could look at a piece of broken machinery, and see almost immediately how the parts were supposed to relate to each other, which repairs were load-bearing, and which were cosmetic, which cracks were structural, and which were surface. That aptitude had gone mostly unused. She had earned her GED through an accelerated program. She had spent the last 18 months doing maintenance work at the group home, fixing what broke and painting what faded, which was most things most of the time, for $8 an hour paid off the books. She was not someone who had ever been given very much. But she had also never, in 22 years of navigating a system that tracked children in folders the way counties tracked parcels of land, developed the habit of expecting to receive nothing. Those were different orientations, and the distance between them was the thing that had kept her moving when moving was the only reasonable option. The folder in her jacket pocket contained a county seal, and a legal description of 40 acres she had never seen and a dead man's name. It was more than she'd had that morning. She would figure out what it meant before she decided what to do with it. She folded the estate document and put it in her jacket pocket. "Can I use the office phone?" she said. "For a long-distance call." Silas Pruitt answered on the second ring. His voice was the kind designed to discourage follow-up questions, efficient and faintly bored. The voice of a man who had handled dozens of estates like this one and had already formed his opinion of where it was heading before the call began. He confirmed that Nora was the named heir, that the will had been properly authenticated, and that she was welcome to come collect the deed if she wanted to assume the taxes. He paused after that, and in the pause was an entire editorial column of unsaid opinion. "I'll be honest with you," he said, which in Nora's experience was what people said immediately before declining to be honest. "The property isn't worth much. The house is in bad shape. The land is steep and rocky, and a good portion of it still sits under an old mineral rights lease from 40 years ago. The back taxes are $4,200. If you don't want the headache, I can put you in touch with a buyer who's been interested in the parcel. You could walk away with enough to cover first month's rent somewhere decent." "Who's the buyer?" "A land management company out of Lexington. Consolidated Resources. They've been acquiring parcels in the area for some time." "What are they offering?" "For this property, I'd estimate somewhere around $12,000 after the taxes are settled." Nora did the math. 12,000 minus 4,200 was 7,800. Against her current $312, the arithmetic was very clear. But something about the speed of Pruitt's arrival at that particular solution before she had asked a single question about the property, before she had expressed any interest or reluctance or preference at all, made her slow down. "I'll come look at it first," she said. The Greyhound to Harlan left Cumberland at 7 in the morning and arrived at 10 past 9, and the Appalachian landscape filled the windows the entire way with the particular beauty that had always coexisted with poverty in eastern Kentucky, the way neighbors sometimes coexist, each aware of the other, neither quite knowing what to do about it. Ridge lines dense with hardwood, creek bottoms cluttered with old equipment and rusted tin roofing, small houses pressed against steep hillsides as if the land were trying incrementally to reclaim them. Nora had grown up in this country. She had never stopped finding it beautiful in a way that felt almost private, the way you felt about a place that had never been quite kind to you, but was still, inexplicably, yours. She had spent the bus ride reading everything she could find on her phone about Harlan County land records, about mineral rights law in Kentucky, about the name Consolidated Resources. The company was real and substantial, a privately held mining and resource development outfit based in Lexington, incorporated in 1984, with a portfolio that spanned coal, natural gas, and what their website described in careful corporate language as strategic mineral asset acquisition across the Appalachian region. There were no photographs of executives on the website. There was a phone number and a form to submit inquiries, and there were photographs of mountains taken from above. She called Pruitt from the Harlan bus station, and he met her at his office on Main Street, a second-floor walk-up above a pharmacy with a hand-painted sign in the window. The office smelled of old paper and the faint sweetness of wood furniture polish, and he was a man in his early 60s who wore a good suit with the ease of someone who had worn good suits for 30 years and entirely stopped noticing them. He handed her the deed paperwork with the efficiency of someone who had expected her to sign and be done. When she took it without signing, his expression rearranged itself into something professionally accommodating. The deed described the parcel as 43 acres, bounded on the north by Callahan Branch Creek, on the east by a county right-of-way, on the south and west by adjacent privately held parcels. The farmhouse was built in 1887. The barn was from the same period. There was a notation about a right-of-way for an old coal haul road decommissioned in 1961 and a reference to a mineral rights lease that Pruitt confirmed had lapsed in 1978. Who was Thomas Callahan? Nora asked. Pruitt rearranged some papers on his desk. Your great-uncle, by the family records we were able to establish. Your mother, Bridget, was the daughter of Patrick Callahan, who was Thomas's younger brother. Patrick died in 1989. Thomas kept the property, lived on it alone for the last 30 years of his life. Did he have contact with the rest of the family? Not that I'm aware of. He was a private man. The phrase had the practiced quality of something said many times about the same person. He filed the will 4 years before he died, and had no further communication with my office until the county coroner's notification came through. How did he die? Heart failure. He was 79 years old. The answer came quickly, cleanly. Will you be assuming the taxes? Nora looked at the deed. The land had a name on it, that was her name. Somewhere in the hills south of Harlan, a farmhouse was sitting empty that had belonged to a man who had gone to the trouble of finding her, specifically her, in a county system, a ward among thousands, and leaving her the only thing he had. She told Pruitt she would let him know by the end of the week. She spent $22 on a taxi to the end of Route 160, where a gravel lane turned off the highway into the trees, and a rusted metal mailbox stood at the mouth of it with Callahan hammered into the side in letters barely readable through the oxidation. The driver looked at the lane and then at her and said nothing, which she appreciated. She paid him and got out. The walk up the lane took 20 minutes. The gravel had gone to grass years ago, and the grass had gone mostly to goldenrod and blackberry cane, with 2 tire tracks worn deep enough to still carry the memory of use. Sugar maples lined both sides, September leaves just beginning to edge toward gold, the light falling through them with the quality of careful preservation, as if the lane itself had been kept intact by some slow, patient attention. At the top of a gentle rise, the trees opened. The farmhouse, 2 stories, white paint stripped to gray wood over most of its surface. The wraparound porch listing badly on the east end where a support post had given up and taken the roofline with it. One upstairs window was broken, cardboard duct taped into the frame from the inside. The front door was shut, and a heavy padlock on a newer hasp was the only thing about the structure that didn't look like it had been slowly negotiating with time and losing. The tin roof had gone orange with rust along the valleys, but showed no obvious failures. Behind the house, through a stand of old locust trees, the dark shape of a hand-hewn timber barn with corrugated metal roofing that had survived through what appeared to be sheer stubbornness. Nora stood at the lanes end with both duffel bags on her shoulders and the cardboard box under one arm, and looked at the building that was, by every legal measure, her house. She tried to name what she felt and arrived at something that wasn't disappointment and wasn't hope, but was perhaps the space between them, the clear-eyed recognition of a problem that would require work, that would cost more than she had, and that was hers alone. She set the bags down and went to look for a way in. She was crouched at the padlock with a hairpin, a skill acquired at 13 in a group home where 4 girls shared one bathroom, and the lock on it was the only privacy available when a voice came from across the lane. That lock's got a quickset cylinder. Won't pick with a straight pin. Nora turned. On the far side of a wire fence dividing the Callahan property from the neighboring field, a woman in her late 70s was leaning on a wooden fence post with the comfort of someone who had been leaning on that particular post for many years. She was small and weathered, wearing rubber boots and a canvas work coat over flannel, white hair cut short under a billed cap. She was studying Nora with the frank curiosity of someone who lived alone and had long since stopped finding the world uninteresting. "There's a spare key under the milk house floor," she said. "Thomas told me 20 years ago, and I never forgot, because that's the kind of thing you don't forget once you hear it." She nodded toward a small stone building set into the hillside at the side of the house. Limestone foundation. West side. Second row of stones from the bottom. Third stone from the corner. Lift the stone. Tobacco tin underneath. Nora found the tin without much trouble. Inside it was a key, modern, which meant Thomas had changed the lock at some point and had still kept the spare in the same hiding place his family had used for 100 years. The padlock opened cleanly. The door swung inward on a house that smelled of closed air, old wood smoke, and the specific mustiness of a place that had been kept carefully for a very long time, and then suddenly left. The interior was not in the state of collapse she'd prepared herself for. The kitchen floorboards were sound. The cast-iron wood stove in the main room was a good quality unit, the firebox clean, the flue damper operational. The stairs to the second floor were solid. The bedroom that had clearly been Thomas's held a full-sized bed with a wool blanket folded at the foot, a chest of drawers, and a window looking out at the back field and the mountains beyond it. Everything was old, but nothing was broken. Thomas had maintained this house with the same quiet persistence he'd apparently applied to everything else in his life. The woman from across the fence appeared at the back door, which Nora had propped open for air, and introduced herself as Margaret Ferris Meg to everyone in the hollow. She lived on the adjacent 12 acres with her daughter's family. She had known Thomas Callahan for more than 40 years, and she sat down at Thomas's walnut table handmade, solid, the work of someone who had taken the craft seriously and talked without needing much encouragement while Nora listened. Thomas had been a private man, not unfriendly, she said, but constitutionally disinclined to share anything he hadn't specifically chosen to share. He had worked a small cattle operation for many years and later just maintained the property, doing mechanical repairs for neighbors, keeping things running. He had never married. He had almost no contact with the rest of the Callahan family, most of whom had left Harlan County in the economic dislocations of the 70s and 80s when the coal operations that had defined the region for a century began their long contraction. What Thomas had done, consistently and stubbornly for 32 years, was refuse to sell. Consolidated Resources had come to him first in 1991 with an offer for the property. He turned them down without apparent deliberation. They came back in 1996, in 2003, in 2008, in 2014, and twice more in the years before he died. Each offer was higher than the last. The most recent, Meg said, had been $60,000 for 40 rocky acres that a man of any ordinary commercial sense would have taken in a heartbeat. Thomas had said no every time, and when people in the hollow asked him why he refused money that would have changed his life, he said the land wasn't his to sell. In between the formal offers, Meg said, there had been other pressure. A lawyer showing up unannounced 3 years ago, walking the perimeter fence without invitation, claiming he was doing a routine boundary survey for an adjacent parcel. A car sitting at the bottom of the lane for a full afternoon the following spring, a man inside it with a camera pointed at the hillside above the farmhouse. County assessors who came to reevaluate the property and spent an unusual amount of time on the ridge behind the barn. Thomas had noted all of it, Meg said, with the calm of someone who had been watching the same pattern for decades and had stopped finding it surprising. He never confronted anyone directly. He just kept saying no and paying his taxes and maintaining the fence lines and going about his business as if the pressure were weather, a condition to be noted and endured rather than anything that changed his plans. That's a strange thing to say about land you own outright, Nora said. Meg's smile was quiet, containing something held back. Thomas was a strange man. Good, but strange. He believed things about this land I never fully understood, and he didn't explain himself often. She turned her coffee mug on the table. He knew you existed. He told me 5 or 6 years ago that he had a great niece somewhere in the county system, and that when the time came he intended to make sure she received what was owed to the family. I didn't ask questions. Thomas didn't answer questions he hadn't already chosen to answer. She stood and picked up her coat from the back of the chair. I'm going to bring a casserole. Nobody should spend their first night in an empty house on an empty stomach. She was gone before Nora could object. That night, Nora ate reheated chicken and vegetables at Thomas's walnut table by the light of a battery lantern in Thomas's house, on Thomas's 40 acres, and listened to the mountain dark settle around the property. The creek at the bottom of the hollow made a sound that was constant and variable, at once the kind of sound that could either keep you awake or put you to sleep, depending entirely on your relationship with stillness. She fell asleep in Thomas's bedroom before she'd resolved the question. The second morning she started at the top of the house and worked down. Not cleaning, cataloging. She moved through every room with the methodical patience that had been her primary instrument for navigating 22 years of situations she hadn't chosen and couldn't change. Thomas had not been a collector in any conventional sense, but he kept things, receipts, letters, farm records going back decades, tools arranged in the barn with a precision that spoke of long habit and genuine care for the objects themselves. The house showed the architecture of a life lived carefully on limited means. Nothing wasted, nothing neglected, the particular dignity of a person who had decided that poverty was not permission to stop maintaining standards. The attic stairs were behind a door at the end of the upstairs hallway, the wood swollen into the frame from years of seasonal movement. She put her shoulder into it the way she'd learned to put her shoulder into resistances that weren't worth reasoning with, and it opened onto a narrow staircase rising into the space under the roofline, floored with rough-cut boards and lit by a single gable window at the far end. The attic was not large. A defunct water tank in the corner. Cardboard boxes sealed with tape gone brittle from age, their labels unreadable. An old steamer trunk plastered with shipping labels from lines that had ceased operating before Nora's mother was born. A dressmaker's form. A wooden crate stenciled Harlan Feed and Seed in faded black. Against the east gable wall, on a wooden shelf built flush with the framing, between a kerosene lantern and a tin of old woodworking files, sat a flat rectangular tin about the size and depth of a hardback book. Its lid was sealed with a strip of electrical tape that had faded from black to gray. Nora picked it up and felt the weight of something solid inside, something that shifted when she tilted the tin. She carried it to the gable window where the light was better and peeled back the tape. Inside, wrapped in a square of flannel cloth that had gone soft with age, was a compass. It was brass, octagonal rather than circular, about 2.5 inches across its widest dimension. Age had darkened the metal to a deep reddish brown, the surface pitted where the lacquer had failed over the decades, though the engraving around the face remained legible. Cardinal directions rendered in an older-style font, with additional degree markings she didn't recognize from standard navigation instruments. The glass crystal over the face was intact and clear. The needle had settled to a bearing that was not north. She oriented herself using the window north was roughly to her right, toward the highway and the valley below, and checked the compass again. The needle was pointing to a bearing approximately 48 degrees east of magnetic north. The compass was not broken. It was pointing at something specific, with the intention of someone who had put it there specifically for that purpose. She turned it over. On the back, scratched into the brass with something sharp a nail, a knife point 2 initials. S.C. Below the tin, tucked against the side wall of the shelf and folded into quarters, was an envelope. Her name was on the front, Nora Margaret Callahan, written in the careful penmanship of someone who had learned to write in an era when the formation of letters was treated as a matter of character rather than mere communication. She stood at the attic window for a long moment with the compass in one hand and the envelope in the other, the mountains clear and gold through the glass behind her, and felt something she could only describe as a change in pressure, the sensation of a space that had been sealed for a long time finally, deliberately, opening. She opened the envelope. The letter was 4 pages, written on both sides of 2 sheets of thin writing paper in the same careful hand as her name on the envelope. The date at the top was November of the previous year, for months before Thomas died. He began by acknowledging that they had never met, and that this was his failure rather than hers, and that he was sorry for it. He had known she was in the system. He had considered, more than once, going through the courts to bring her to live with him. But he was already old by the time he found her through the state records, and a farm in the Harlan County hills was not what any court would have considered an appropriate placement for a child. He had been afraid they would be right. So he had waited, and watched from a distance, and put his affairs in order so that when she came into her majority, there would be something waiting for her, something he had spent 30 years protecting without knowing exactly what it was. Only that the people who wanted it were willing to pay far too much for the wanting to mean nothing. The compass, he wrote, had belonged to Seamus Callahan, Nora's great-great-grandfather, an Irish immigrant who came to Harlan County in the summer of 1882 at the age of 24, on foot, with a surveyor's transit on his back and $7 in his coat pocket. Seamus had come during the first great wave of industrial development in the Cumberland Mountains. The railroad was pushing south and west, and the coal and timber companies were moving fast to acquire everything in their path. He was not a miner. He was a trained surveyor, the son of a county engineer in County Clare, Ireland, who had learned the science of reading the earth from his father and who had crossed the Atlantic with those skills and the intention of putting them to work in a country where land was being measured and claimed at a pace his father could barely comprehend from across an ocean. He found work immediately. The coal companies needed surveyors who could produce fast, accurate plats of the hollows and ridge lines they were buying for extraction. Seamus worked for 3 different operations in his first decade in Harlan County, walking ridges with a transit and chain, recording his findings in field books that became the foundational documents of mineral rights claims that would eventually draw hundreds of millions of tons of coal from the mountains. But Seamus was not only surveying for the companies. He was also surveying for himself. Thomas's letter explained this with care. Seamus had learned the land in a way that the company surveyors rarely had time to learn it, because the companies wanted results fast and had no patience for the kind of deep, patient study that took months of quiet observation. Seamus had patience for exactly that. In the evenings, and on his own time, he walked the ridges above his small cabin, mapping the formations he found there with the same precision he applied to his paid work. He filed his own mineral claims at the Harlan County Courthouse, using the legal forms he had learned from the county records office, paying the small filing fees from his wages. He did this quietly, telling almost no one, because he had grown up in a country where visible property was an invitation to dispossession, and he understood from his earliest years in Kentucky that the same lesson applied here without modification. By 1898, Seamus Callahan owned, through properly executed and recorded mineral claim filings, the subsurface rights to approximately 3,000 acres of Harlan County ridgeland. The surface rights to most of that acreage had long since been acquired by coal and timber companies. But the mineral rights, filed and documented and legally recorded, belonged to Seamus alone. The coal companies discovered this years later. There were lawyers. There were threats. There were nights when men Seamus didn't know came to his property and damaged his fences and killed 2 of his cattle. He spent the better part of 4 years in the county courthouse and 2 additional years in the state court in Frankfort defending the validity of his claims before a judge ruled in his favor in 1904. But the ruling, Seamus understood, was not the end of the matter. The companies had lost in court, but they were organizations run by men with long memories and longer resources, and a favorable judgment in a county courthouse meant only that the opposition had gone underground the same way coal went underground where it would wait. Sometime between the court ruling and his death in 1921, Seamus hid the documentation. Thomas did not know the full details of what Seamus had hidden or precisely where. What he knew was what his own grandfather, Cathal Callahan, Seamus's son, had passed to him in the last years of Cathal's life. The hiding had been deliberate and thorough. The compass was the beginning of the trail. The needle was not broken. A watchmaker in Harlan had fixed it to a specific bearing in 1905, pointing from the standing stone at the northeast corner of the property toward the next point in a sequence that Seamus had laid out with a surveyor's precision across the land itself. He had built the trail the way he built his mineral filings. Each step sequential, each point requiring the one before it to have been found. The system designed by a man who had surveyed hundreds of square miles of this terrain and understood how to make the land itself keep a secret. Follow the compass bearing from the standing stone. The rest will follow. Thomas had not followed the trail himself. He was old, he wrote, and the years had taken from him the physical capacity the trail required. He had made a decision long ago that the trail was not his to follow, that his work was to hold the land, to keep it out of the hands of the people who wanted it, and to wait for the right person to arrive. That was 32 years of saying no. He had done it without complaint, and he was not looking for acknowledgement. He ended the letter with 2 sentences that Nora read 3 times. Then a 4th time, standing still at the attic window with the mountains going bright in the morning light behind the glass. I don't know exactly what Seamus left, or what it would be worth in the world today. But I know that every time Consolidated Resources raised their offer, the size of that offer told me something, and the last figure they brought to my table was so far above any reasonable valuation of this land that whatever lies beneath it must be worth a great deal more than they ever let anyone say out loud. Nora folded the letter. She sat down on the old steamer trunk with the compass in her hands and stayed there for a while without moving. And the morning light came through the gable window at a low angle and caught the brass and made it briefly warm. The next morning, she drove into Harlan in the truck she'd borrowed from Meg, a 1998 Chevy with a cracked dashboard and 214,000 miles on the odometer that ran with the mechanical dignity of something that had decided to outlast all reasonable expectations, and went to the county courthouse to look at land records. Earl Dunmore had worked in the Harlan County Land Records Office for 31 years. He had the kind of expertise that grows in people who spend decades doing precise, necessary work that the outside world pays almost no attention to. A deep, detailed knowledge of one specific domain, accumulated so gradually it had become indistinguishable from the person himself. He was a thin man in his 60s who wore reading glasses on a cord around his neck and moved through the record stacks without apparent effort, as if the room's geography were simply an extension of his memory. Nora explained what she needed: mineral claim filings for the Callahan property, all of them, going back to the 1880s if there were any. Earl took her to the pre-digital records stored in the climate-controlled back room, which smelled of cold air and the specific dry quality of old paper that has been properly maintained. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. He spent 45 minutes pulling documents without commentary, setting them on the reading table in sequence, and when he was finished, he stood back and let her look. The mineral claim filings were there, all 18 of them, Seamus Callahan's name on every one, running from 1888 to 1916, each properly witnessed and stamped with the county seal of the relevant period. They covered, by Nora's calculation from the legal descriptions, approximately 3,040 acres of subsurface mineral rights across the ridge system above Callahan Hollow. Every document was intact. Every filing was legally executed. Are these enforceable? Nora asked. After all this time? Earl looked at her over his reading glasses with the measured patience of a man who had spent 31 years answering questions from people who didn't quite know what they were asking. Properly filed mineral rights in Kentucky don't expire on their own, he said. They convey by inheritance or deed the same way surface rights do. If Thomas Callahan held these at his death and left them to you without other encumbrances, they're yours now. He was quiet for a moment. I've pulled these records for outside requests 3 times since I've worked here. All 3 requests came from the same company. He touched the edge of one filing without picking it up. Consolidated Resources. First pull was 2006. Last one was 18 months ago. The room's climate control made a low, steady sound. What's under the ridge? Nora said. Earl straightened a stack of plat books, aligning the edges with both hands. It was a careful, deliberate gesture. I'm a records clerk, he said. I know what's in the files, not what's in the ground. He looked at her once more, directly, and his voice was precise. But I'll say this. I know what land companies have been pursuing in this part of Kentucky for the last 20 years. And it hasn't been coal for a long time now. She photographed every document with her phone and backed the images up to a cloud account she'd created on the courthouse Wi-Fi before leaving the building. Earl watched without interfering. He walked her back out through the main office and, as she was going, said her name once she turned, and he looked at her with an expression that was careful and brief. Good luck, he said. That was all. She drove back to the farm with the windows down, the September air cold and clean off the ridges. The photographs were saved in 2 places, and the originals were in the county records where they had always been, where no private party could remove or alter them. She parked at the bottom of the Callahan Lane and sat in the truck for a while looking at the mountains through the windshield, thinking about an out-of-Lexington land company that had searched those same records 3 separate times over 18 years, and about the $60,000 offer that Consolidated Resources had made for 40 rocky acres of Harlan County hollows that every rational measure said should be worth a fraction of that. Then she went to find the standing stone. Thomas's letter had given her the northeast corner of the property. Meg confirmed the stone, a large sandstone boulder at the corner marker, there as long as anyone in the hollow remembered, probably there long before the Callahans arrived. From the courthouse plat, Nora had the rough orientation, and she cross-referenced the bearing indicated on Seamus's compass against magnetic north using her phone. The fixed needle pointed at approximately 48 degrees, east-northeast, from the standing stone's location toward the ridge above. She crossed the back pasture, climbed the fence at the wood lot edge, and moved into the trees. The undergrowth was thick with end-of-season goldenrod and ironweed, with young pawpaws growing dense in the low light and tulip poplars shooting fast toward whatever sky they could find. She moved through it steadily, compass in one hand, not hurrying, the land rising under her feet toward the ridge face above the hollow. Sugar maples gave way to oaks and hickories, the canopy closing overhead, the forest floor quieter and more shadowed than the open ground below. She was thinking about Seamus walking this same slope in the months after his court victory in 1904, in the years when the companies had gone underground with their opposition, rather than abandon it. Walking these ridges with his surveyor's instruments and his immigrant's understanding of what happened to people who kept their documents where other people could reach them. Building a trail across the land itself, each point requiring the one before it, the whole system sequenced like a proof in geometry, each step dependent on the last. The final conclusion only available to someone who had started at the beginning and followed every step in order. She had been walking for 40 minutes when the trees thinned slightly at the northeast corner of the property where the land pressed against the ridge base, and she found the stone. Thinking about Seamus, she was also thinking about Thomas. 32 years of saying no. She tried to hold that number in her mind and give it its full weight. 32 years of offers that came in higher each time, of lawyers showing up unannounced, of cars sitting at the lane's end with cameras pointed at the hillside. 32 years of a man with no family and limited means choosing, again and again, to protect something he didn't fully understand, only knowing that it mattered and that the people who wanted it badly enough to make that fact, by itself, a reason to refuse them. That was the inheritance she'd actually received, she thought. Not the 40 acres, not the mineral filings. The 32 years of no. It was larger than she'd expected. Pale tint sandstone, roughly 6 feet high and 4 feet across at the widest point, planted in the earth at the base of the ridge slope with the permanence of something that had stopped being geology and started being landmark at some point so distant that the distinction had ceased to matter. Lichen crossed its south face in thick patterns of gray and rust. The north face, shaded for most of the day, was darker and smoother, almost polished, looking along one section where, Nora thought, generations of hands had probably done exactly what hers did now, reached out and touched it, as if checking that it was still there. She took out Seamus's compass and confirmed the bearing. The needle pointed uphill, northeast along the ridge face, into the dense hardwood above. She examined the stone. She moved around it slowly, looking at every surface at every height from ground level to as high as she could reach, running her fingers along the edges and the faces. On the east side, near the base, almost concealed behind a clump of wood fern that had rooted into a small pocket of accumulated soil at the stone's edge, her fingers found a change in the surface. Not a crack caused by weathering. A seam. 4 sides of a square, the edges too straight and too parallel to be anything but deliberate, framing a section of the face approximately 8 inches on a side. She cleared the fern away with her hand. The seam was precise, clean work, done with the correct tools by someone who knew what they were doing. She pressed against the square and felt no give. She looked along the upper edge and found it. A small iron pin, barely extending from a drilled hole just above the square's top edge, dark with rust but solid in the stone. She pressed it inward with her thumb. A dry mechanical click, clear in the silence. The square section hinged inward. Behind it was a cavity in the rock, roughly cylindrical, sealed from weather by the mass of the stone above it and the precision of the closure. The air that came out was cool and dry. She reached in carefully. Her fingers closed on metal. She drew it out. A tin tube, 8 inches long and 2 inches in diameter, both ends sealed with solder that had gone rough with age but held. The surface showed only light rust. The cavity had stayed dry for over a century, and the seal had done its job for every one of those years. Nora sat down with her back against the standing stone. The mountains rose above her. The creek sound came from a long way below. The September sky was going deep and clear blue over the ridge line, the kind of blue that happens in the mountains in the afternoon when the light starts to angle differently and the air sharpens. She sat there for a while with the tin tube in both hands, not opening it yet, just holding it. She thought about Thomas Callahan saying no 7 times over 32 years. She thought about Seamus Callahan walking this slope in 1905 with a watchmaker's compass and a surveyor's understanding of the land and the patience of someone who had already been through the court system and come out the other side and knew that winning a legal judgment was not the same thing as winning. She thought about the $60,000 offer that a Lexington land company had put on the table for 40 acres of Rocky Hollows, and about the 3 searches of the Harlan County records going back 18 years, and about what Earl Dunmore had said about what land companies were pursuing in Kentucky these days. She carried the tube back down the hill in both hands, crossed the back pasture, went into the kitchen, and set it on Thomas's walnut table. She found a flathead screwdriver in the kitchen drawer and worked the solder at one end carefully. 10 minutes of patient effort, the old solder brittle and cooperative. She extracted the inner cap. She tilted the tube. A tightly rolled piece of paper slid out, wrapped in oilcloth that crumbled slightly at the edges but had done its job for over 100 years. She unrolled it on the table with both palms flat against it. It was a hand-drawn map. Clearly a fragment, the right edge a cut edge, not a tear, deliberate, meaning the full map had been divided into pieces, and this was one of them. The drafting was professional, the lines measured and precise, the notation style of someone formally trained in survey work. She could identify Callahan Branch Creek, the line of the Old Hall Road, the standing stone marked with a small X and the letter A. Further up the ridge, at the end of a dotted line running from A, another mark a small drawn square labeled B. Below the map, in the same brown ink, a single sentence. B holds C, and C holds the rest. Leave nothing where others can move it. And below that, in darker ink, added later in a hand slightly less steady, S, C, 1905. For the one who needs it. Nora stood at the walnut table in the kitchen light and looked at the dotted line running from the standing stone to wherever B was on that ridge. She looked at Seamus's compass beside the map, its fixed needle pointing in exactly the same direction as the dotted line. One point led to the next. Each step required the one before it. The system was complete, and it had been waiting the same way a properly filed county document waited in a records room, patient and exact, and entirely indifferent to the passage of time for someone who knew how to follow it. She thought about the instruction below the map. B holds C, and C holds the rest. She was at A. She had found B marked on the fragment. The trail had 2 more points after that, at minimum, and the fact that Seamus had written the instruction at all had felt the need to explain the sequence suggested that what waited at the end of it was not something you could stumble into accidentally. You had to earn each point to get the next. You had to be the kind of person who started at the beginning and stayed with it all the way through. She thought about a man born in County Clare, Ireland, in 1858, crossing the Atlantic at 23, walking into the Cumberland Mountains with $7 and a transit on his back, surveying ridges for coal companies by day and for himself by night, filing claims that nobody paid attention to because who would bother filing claims on ridge land when there was so much land to acquire and so little time? She thought about the 4 years of lawyers and the 2 years in Frankfurt and the nights when men came to his fence and his cattle, and about the patience that had been required to absorb all of that and still keep going, still come back to the courthouse and argue the law and win. She thought about the watchmaker in Harlan in 1905, carefully removing the compass needle, resetting it to a fixed bearing, sealing it back under the glass. The specificity of that act, the commitment it represented. This wasn't a man leaving a rough note under a rock. This was a man building a system designed to survive not just years but generations, designed to outlast him and his children and his grandchildren, designed to wait for exactly the right person in exactly the right circumstances, someone desperate enough to search and careful enough to follow. Outside the kitchen window, the mountains went from green to dark against the evening sky, and the creek kept its constant conversation with the stones far below, and Nora pressed her palms flat on Thomas Callahan's table and understood that what Seamus had built across this land was not a hiding place. It was a test. Each step a question. Are you patient enough? Are you careful enough? Do you read the land the way it needs to be read? And if you pass each question in sequence, the land itself gives you the next one, all the way to the end. She would follow it in the morning. Tonight she sat with the compass and the map fragment and Thomas's letter and the last of Meg's casserole, and she let herself feel, for the first time in longer than she could precisely measure, something that was not quite hope, but occupied the same general territory, close enough that distinguishing between them seemed like the wrong use of the evening. The mountains beyond the window went from dark green to black. The hollow went quiet the way hollows went quiet in the mountains, not silent, but settled, every sound finding its place, the creak and the wind and the occasional shift of timber in the cooling air. September settled over Callahan Ridge with the weight of a place that had been holding something in reserve for a very long time and was only now, carefully, beginning to release it. The morning came in cold, the way September mornings arrive in the mountains when the season has finally made up its mind which direction it's going. Nora was up before 5:30, sitting at Thomas's table by the light of the battery lantern with the map fragment spread flat in front of her and Seamus's compass beside it, going over everything she had the way she used to go over broken machinery, before touching it, identifying each component, tracing the relationships between them, understanding the logic of the whole before moving any single part. The fragment showed point A at the standing stone and point B up the ridge, connected by a dotted line with two intermediate tick marks at equal intervals. It also showed a creek line she recognized as Callahan Branch, the ridge contour, and the partial outline of a structure near B, not a natural feature, but something built, rectangular, its walls drawn with the deliberate double line that surveyors use to distinguish constructed objects from topography. The structure was small, perhaps 10 by 12 feet by the scale of the map, and it sat against the ridge face rather than freestanding, which suggested it had been built into the hillside. Seamus's notation beside it read SF/1888 in his careful hand. Springhouse. Built 1888. She put Seamus's compass on the map fragment, orienting the face to the direction the dotted line ran, and confirmed what she'd calculated the previous evening. The bearing from A to B was roughly 30 degrees northeast of the standing stone bearing, not the same direction as the fixed needle, which meant the compass served as the key to A, and once you reached A, the map fragment told you how to find B, sequential, each element requiring the previous one. Meg appeared at the back door at 6:15 with 2 hard-boiled eggs and a thermos of coffee, which Nora accepted without asking how Meg had known she'd be up. Old women who had lived alone in mountain hollows for decades developed a particular kind of attentiveness to their neighbors' habits, and Meg had clearly been doing it for years. They ate together without much conversation, Meg looking out the kitchen window at the ridge and saying nothing about the map on the table or the compass beside it, and Nora decided that Thomas had probably prepared Meg for a certain amount of quiet, purposeful activity in this kitchen after he was gone. She started up the ridge at 7, compass in her jacket pocket and the map fragment in a Ziploc bag folded carefully inside her shirt. The morning air was sharp enough to see her breath, and the dew on the goldenrod had turned to frost along the shadowed edges of the pasture. She crossed the wood lot fence and moved back into the trees, climbing steadily, the ridge face rising steeply above the mixed hardwood understory. The route was different from the path to the standing stone, angling further north along the ridge base before turning up, following a natural drainage line that cut through the slope in a shallow ravine where the ground was soft and the leaf litter deep. Old tulip poplars and hemlocks dominated this section of the ridge, their trunks straight and tall, the canopy 60 feet above the forest floor. She moved through them with her head down, watching her footing on the wet leaves and exposed roots, aware that a twisted ankle on this slope was a problem that would require explaining to Meg, and she did not yet want to explain to Meg what she was looking for. The ground was softer here than on the trail to the standing stone, the soil darker and wetter, fed by seeps that came out of the limestone above and moved downhill through the leaf litter before finding the creek below. She noticed the seeps as she climbed because a trained eye noticed anomalies, and these were anomalous. The water that emerged from cracks in the exposed rock faces left a faint white crystalline residue on the surrounding stones, a mineral deposit that didn't look like ordinary limestone carbonate. The color was slightly different, a brighter, more chalk-like white with a faint shimmer at the edges where the dried mineral caught the low morning light. She photographed 3 of them with her phone, getting close enough to see the texture of the deposits, and kept moving. She had been climbing for 40 minutes when the slope eased onto a narrow bench of land, and she found the springhouse. It was a roofless stone structure built directly into the hillside, where the slope flattened briefly onto a narrow bench of land, exactly the kind of location a practical builder would have chosen. with the hillside itself forming the back wall and providing both structural support and the cool ground temperature that a spring house needed to function. The walls were hand-laid limestone, each stone fitted without mortar in the traditional dry stack method, and they had held their courses for 135 years with only minor slippage at the upper corners. The roof was gone entirely, the wooden members long since rotted out, but the walls stood chest-high, and their integrity was solid. A low door opening remained in the south wall, 2 vertical stones with a horizontal lintel, the lintel barely 4 feet high, requiring a person to duck to enter. Nora stood outside the door opening for a moment, looking at the structure, and thought about what she already knew about spring houses, that they were built over springs, that the flow of cool groundwater through the stone floor kept interior temperatures low even in summer, and that the spring that fed this one had emerged from the limestone formation at the exact location Seamus had chosen to build. The spring appeared to have dried up at some point. There was no water flowing, and the stone floor inside was dry. But the structure itself was sound, and Seamus had built it here for reasons beyond dairy storage. She ducked through the door opening. The interior was approximately 10 by 12 feet, the floor covered in a thin layer of leaf debris that had blown in through the open roof over decades. The stone floor beneath the debris was irregular in one critical way. Most of the floor was composed of irregular limestone flags laid flat, but in the center, roughly 3 feet by 2 feet, was a single squared-off slab of the same pale tint sandstone she had seen at the standing stone. It was cut more precisely than anything else in the structure, its edges straight and its surface smooth, and it sat flush with the surrounding floor with the precision of something that had been deliberately fitted rather than laid for function. She cleared the leaf debris from the slab with her foot. In the center of the slab, recessed into a shallow rectangular cavity, was an iron ring. The ring lay flat against the stone, folded down into its groove so that it would be invisible unless you were looking directly at it from above, its surface black with old rust, but solid when she gripped it and lifted. The slab moved. It was heavy, perhaps 200 pounds, and it moved on a pivot point set into the stone below, not a lift but a swing, hinged on one long edge, revealing a rectangular opening about 18 inches wide and 3 feet long. Cold air came up from below, the specific kind of cold that came from sealed underground spaces where temperature had been constant for a very long time. She clicked on her flashlight and directed it into the shaft. Iron rungs set into the stone wall descended into darkness. 6 of them, each one driven into the limestone with lead anchors she could see even from above. Careful work, permanent work, the work of someone who intended the installation to last. Below the last rung, the shaft opened into a larger space. She lowered herself in, testing each rung before weighting it. The metal was rough with rust, but the anchors held. 6 rungs down, she reached the floor of the chamber below, and she swept her flashlight around in a single, slow arc. The room was roughly 8 feet by 10, stone-walled and stone-floored, the ceiling only slightly higher than her head. The walls were dry, no seepage, no mold, the air cold and still in the way of spaces that had been successfully sealed against moisture. Against the far wall, covering nearly the full width of the chamber, sat a trunk. It was iron-bound, the wood beneath the iron a dark hardwood she didn't immediately recognize, the leather straps that bound it dried to the rigidity of old bark. The iron fittings at the corners were the kind she had seen in photographs of 19th century sea chests, heavy castings, practical and durable, designed for cargo that needed to survive rough handling and wet weather. On the lid, in what appeared to be a wood-burning or hot iron inscription, 2 words, S. Callahan. She knelt in front of it. The leather straps, brittle with age, came apart when she worked the buckles, not requiring force, simply reaching the end of what 100 years of slow deterioration could sustain. The lid came up on hinges that resisted and then gave, and the smell that came out of the interior was the smell of old metal and dry leather, and something else beneath it, a mineral sharpness she couldn't quite name. At the top of the trunk, nested together in chamois cloth that had once been soft and was now a single firm mass, were coins. She picked up the first one and held it in the flashlight beam. An American double eagle, $20 gold piece, the date 1893 stamped clearly below the eagle's tail feathers. The gold gleamed exactly as gold gleamed when it had been sealed away from air and humidity for more than a century, which was to say it gleamed as if it had been minted that morning. She counted them later, back at the farmhouse, 287 coins in total. Double eagles and a handful of earlier gold pieces. Some of them dates she would eventually learn from a numismatist in Lexington were uncommon and therefore worth significantly above their gold content. There were 3 1879 double eagles, which the numismatist would later describe as scarce in any condition, and a single 1907 high-relief coin, the St. Gaudens design that had been struck for only 1 year before the difficulty of production caused the design to be modified a coin that commanded prices. He said that would surprise her. The total weight of gold alone, at current spot price, came to just under $1. 2 million. The numismatic premium on the rarer dates and conditions brought that figure higher. Nora wrote it all down in a notebook she had bought in Harlan and kept adding to what she had, where it was, what it was worth. In a handwriting she kept getting neater as the numbers she was recording got larger. Below the coins, wrapped in individual skins of oilcloth so old the cloth had fused with the exterior of what it covered, were 6 journals. Each one was a bound volume. The covers heavy board over leather, the pages thick rag paper of the kind that lasted when cheaper wood pulp paper had long since gone brittle and brown. They were numbered in sequence with a Roman numeral on the front cover, I through 6, in the same careful hand as everything else Seamus had left. Below the journals, rolled and wrapped in the same waterproof oilcloth treatment, was a set of survey maps hand-drawn, large format, the kind that required a drafting table to produce properly. She unrolled one edge to confirm they were geological surveys, saw the cross-sectional notation and formation labels, and rolled it carefully back. She would read these at the house, in better light. At the very bottom of the trunk, lying flat against the wood, was a second tin tube. Smaller than the one from the standing stone cavity, 6 inches rather than 8, but sealed in the same way, both ends soldered. She set it aside with the intention of opening it after she had read what came before it. And resting on top of the tin tube, pinned flat by its own weight, was an envelope, addressed in Seamus Callahan's hand to my heir and the heir of my heirs. The paper was thick and the address was still clear, and the fold lines of the envelope showed that no one had opened it since he sealed it. Nora picked it up and held it for a moment and then put it in her jacket pocket because she would not read it in a cold underground room with a flashlight, and Seamus had waited 120 years already, and he could wait another hour. She made 3 trips up and down the ridge. The journals and geological maps went in her duffel bag. The coins went in 2 zip-locked bags in her jacket pockets, the weight of them substantial against her sides. The small tin tube she carried in her hand. By the time she had the trunk's contents down to the farmhouse, it was past noon, and she had been climbing and descending the ridge for 5 hours, and her legs knew it, and she didn't care. She spread everything on Thomas's table and the kitchen counter and the 2 chairs and sat down and looked at it. 287 gold coins. 6 journals wrapped in a century of oilcloth. A roll of geological surveys. A sealed letter. A sealed tin tube. And Seamus's compass on the table beside all of it, its fixed needle pointing at the same bearing it had pointed at for 120 years, patient as iron. She opened Seamus's letter first. It was 3 pages in the same precise hand, dated June of 1908, 3 years after he had fixed the compass needle and built the trail, 2 years after his sons Cathal and Patrick were old enough to understand what he was explaining to them. He began by addressing his heir directly. With none of the apologetic preamble of Thomas's letter, he wrote to whoever would eventually read his words the same way he wrote in his field journals, with the confidence of a man describing something he had observed precisely and wished to communicate accurately. He explained that he had come to Kentucky in 1882 as a surveyor and had become, over 20 years of close study of the ridge formations above Callahan Hollow, something more than a coal country draftsman. He had surveyed hundreds of square miles of Appalachian terrain and had noticed that the formations above his property behaved differently from the coal-bearing strata that dominated the region. The rock was older limestone. The Pennsylvanian formation the coal companies considered nearly worthless, not thick enough with organic material to be coal country, not simple enough to be quarry stone. The companies surveyed it, noted it, and moved on. Seamus had not moved on. He described what he had documented with a surveyor's exactness. The limestone formation above the hollow showed patterns of karst dissolution water-carved cavities and channels that were consistent with the movement of mineral-bearing brines through the rock over geological time. Where that water emerged at the surface, it left deposits. White crystalline material on the rocks around the seeps, blue-gray mineral staining in the joints of the limestone, the kind of efflorescence that spoke of concentrated dissolved minerals cycling through a living geological system. He had submitted 2 rock samples to a chemist in Frankfurt in 1896, asking what they contained. The chemist identified calcium carbonate, magnesium carbonate, and several other compounds he listed in abbreviated notation that Seamus copied faithfully into the letter. One compound designated only as Compound B, alkaline mineral, unknown commercial application, was present in concentrations the chemist described as highly unusual for limestone country. Seamus did not know what Compound B was, or whether it had any value. He knew only that its presence was consistent across every seep on the ridge, that the concentrations increased with elevation toward the main ridge line, and that no company surveyor had ever mentioned it or appeared to notice it. He had documented everything. The geological maps in the trunk represented 30 years of detailed observation of the formation, its extent, its depth, the location of the most concentrated seeps, the pattern of dissolution features that traced the underground movement of the brine. He had no way of knowing what any of it would mean to the people who came after him, but he had learned enough from his years of legal fighting to understand that what a powerful company did not want you to have was almost by definition worth having, and that the appropriate response was not to sell it cheap, but to document it thoroughly and protect it until the world caught up to understanding its value. One sentence near the end of the letter stayed with Nora after she had folded it and set it down. I surveyed this land for 30 years, and I never fully understood what I found. But I understood enough to know that whoever stands on that ridge in another century will understand it completely, and that when they do, my family should be standing there beside them with the documents in their hands. Nora was still sitting with that sentence when the sound of a car coming up the lane reached her through the kitchen window. It was a white SUV, new model, the kind of vehicle that communicated a specific kind of institutional confidence without being ostentatious about it. It parked in front of the house with the deliberate care of someone who was aware that the manner of parking was itself a communication. A man got out. He was in his mid-40s, wearing clothes that were neither office nor outdoor, but somewhere between them the calculated practical attire of someone who wanted to appear approachable while looking expensive. He walked to the front door with the unhurried ease of a person who was accustomed to being let in. He knocked once and waited. Nora had put the journals and the maps and the coins and the letters in her duffel bag and the duffel bag in the bedroom closet before he knocked, moving with the same calm efficiency she used when she knew someone was watching and didn't want them to know she'd noticed. She opened the door. "Miss Callahan." His voice was pleasant, measured, the voice of someone who had spent time learning to seem reasonable. "My name is Brecken Cole. I'm a vice president with Consolidated Resources in Lexington. I'm sorry to drop by without calling ahead." He smiled with what appeared to be genuine apology. "I was in the area for some community outreach meetings, and I wanted to stop and introduce myself personally. We've been neighbors to this property for many years, and I hope we might have a conversation." Nora held the door and said nothing. Cole took her silence as an invitation and kept talking. He expressed condolences about Thomas, said the company had always respected Thomas's decision about the property, even when they disagreed with it. Said he hoped Nora's transition to the area had been smooth. He made a brief comment about how the county had a lot to offer if you gave it a chance. He expressed admiration for the farmhouse's bones, said the stone construction in the outbuildings was really something, said he'd always thought it was a beautiful piece of land. He said all of this with the relaxed fluency of someone who had done exactly this kind of visit many times before and had refined the opening to a point where it sounded improvised. Nora stood in the doorway and noted the details, the way he kept his hands visible and relaxed, the way he glanced once, casually, at the kitchen behind her, the way he'd used the word transition, which was a word chosen to sound neutral while implying that her situation was temporary and uncertain. Then he said he'd been glad to hear she'd had a chance to look at the land and understand what she'd inherited, and that he hoped she'd also had a chance to think about whether this was the right situation for a young woman starting out. "We've made several offers on the property over the years," he said. I want to be transparent with you about that. We have a genuine interest in the land for resource development purposes. Given that you've only just taken ownership and the property needs significant investment, I thought it might be worth having an honest conversation about whether a purchase arrangement might work for both of us. He paused in the way of someone who has rehearsed their pauses. We'd be prepared to offer $200,000 for the parcel. Cash settlement within 30 days. We'd handle the tax obligations and any outstanding estate costs. $200,000. Against the $312 she had arrived with, the number was staggering. She was aware of it landing in her chest with the physical weight of a real amount of money, and she gave herself exactly 1 second to feel that weight, and then she let it go. "How did you know I'd been looking at the land?" she said. Cole's expression stayed steady. "It's a small county. People notice things." "What people?" "I'm not sure I can say specifically. You know how rural communities are." He kept the pleasant tone without any apparent difficulty. "The offer stands regardless. You have my card through the attorney of record. I hope you'll consider it seriously, Miss Callahan. This is a complicated piece of property with some old legal history attached to it that could take years to untangle, and I'd hate to see a young woman spend years navigating that alone when there's a cleaner path available." Nora looked at him for a moment. He was good. The threat in the last sentence was real, but the language around it was so carefully constructed that a person could hear it as concern rather than warning, as helpful rather than menacing, if they chose to hear it that way. "I'll think about it," she said. She watched his car from the kitchen window after he'd gone. It pulled to the bottom of the lane and stopped there. The engine didn't shut off. She could see the exhaust. For 42 minutes, by her phone's clock, the SUV sat at the bottom of the lane with its engine running. Then it pulled out and went south on Route 160 toward Harlan. She called Meg. Meg listened to the description of Cole's visit and the 42 minutes at the bottom of the lane and said, without apparent surprise, that she had a name for Nora. There was a lawyer in Lexington named Clara Hobbs who had handled mineral rights disputes in eastern Kentucky for 12 years and had a reputation for taking cases against corporate clients when the evidence justified it. She had worked with a family in Bell County 2 years earlier over a similar situation, a mineral claim dispute with a mining company that had tried to acquire the rights through a fraudulent title challenge. Meg knew this because her daughter's husband's cousin had been the family in Bell County, and the outcome had been a settlement in their favor. Nora called Clara Hobbs from the Farmhouse phone, using the landline Thomas had kept in service all those years because cell reception in the hollow was unreliable. Clara answered herself, no assistant, on the second ring. Her voice was direct and businesslike with an undertone of sharpness that suggested she made decisions fast and didn't revisit them. Nora gave her the summary in 5 minutes. The mineral claim filings at the courthouse, the 3 consolidated resources searches of those records, the repeated offers over 32 years, Cole's visit, and his $200,000 offer, Earl Dunmore's comment about what land companies were pursuing in Kentucky these days. Clara asked 3 questions. What were the filing dates and claim numbers? Had Thomas's estate been fully probated, or were there outstanding proceedings? Had Consolidated Resources made any formal legal challenge to the mineral claims? Then she asked the question that stopped Nora mid-breath. Has anyone conducted a geological assessment of the ridge formations above the property recently? Because when a company offers above market value this many times over this many years, they've done their homework. They know what they're buying. And if I'm going to represent your interests effectively, I need to know whether their homework is public record or whether they've kept it private. Nora told Clara about Earl's comment about what land companies had been pursuing in Kentucky and about how it hadn't been coal. She told her about the mineral seeps on the ridge and the white crystalline deposits. She didn't mention the trunk or the journals yet. She wasn't ready to tell anyone about those. Clara said she would call back within 48 hours and told Nora not to sign anything, not to accept any money, not to have any further conversations with Cole or with Silas Pruitt, and to document any contact from Consolidated Resources from this point forward. Date, time, what was said, who was present, she said. Start from Cole's visit today and go backward as far as you can remember. I'll need that record. She hung up before Nora could ask what she expected to find. Clara called back in 36 hours, not 48. It was an early morning call, before 7, and her voice had the contained energy of someone who had been up late reading documents and had found things that changed the shape of what she was looking at. I need to tell you some things in sequence, she said, because the picture only makes sense if you see how the pieces fit together. She had started with Consolidated Resources public filings with the Kentucky Department of Natural Resources and had found, buried in a 900-page environmental review application submitted 6 months ago, 6 months, Nora noted, after Thomas Callahan died, a commissioned geological assessment of the ridge formations above Callahan Hollow. The assessment had been conducted by a Denver-based geological consulting firm and was stamped Proprietary Preliminary Assessment, which meant Consolidated Resources had submitted it as supporting documentation for a mineral extraction license application, while arguing that the detailed findings were trade secrets and should be withheld from public review. The state agency had rejected that argument and required full disclosure as a condition of proceeding. The document was therefore public, sitting in a DNR filing database, accessible to anyone who knew where to look and had enough patience to look through 900 pages of environmental review to find it. The formation above your property, Clara said, is what geologists call a lithium-bearing sedimentary brine deposit. It's a limestone karst system that has been concentrating lithium carbonate in groundwater over millions of years. The brines move through the rock and emerge at surface, seeps those white crystalline deposits you described. That's lithium carbonate precipitating out of solution when the water hits the air. She paused. Lithium is the primary component in EV batteries. The demand for it has tripled in the last 8 years and is projected to triple again in the next 15. Domestic lithium sources are a national priority right now. Nora sat very still at Thomas's table. The assessment estimates extractable lithium reserves of approximately 340,000 metric tons across the ridge system above Callahan Hollow, along with secondary deposits of cobalt and nickel in the associated formations. At current market prices, with current extraction technology, the total estimated value of the mineral deposit is $420 million over a 25-year extraction period. Clara's voice was level, unhurried. She had clearly said large numbers to clients before and had learned to say them without inflection so that the person on the other end had a moment to absorb them without the speaker's tone pushing them in a direction. The assessment is based on the full 3,040 acres covered by your great-great-grandfather's mineral claims. Without those claims, the extraction license application fails because Consolidated Resources doesn't hold the mineral rights to the core of the deposit. Nora sat with the phone against her ear and looked at the kitchen, the walnut table Thomas had built, the wood stove with its cast-iron door, the window above the sink, and through it the back field, and above the field the ridge line, where the limestone face was exposed in outcrops she could see from here as pale lines against the dark of the hardwood canopy. She had sat at this table 4 days ago with $312 in a checking account, and the land outside the window had been a liability she was deciding whether to assume. The land outside the window was the same land. The limestone in the ridge face was the same limestone. The white mineral deposits at the seeps were the same deposits. None of it had changed. What had changed was that she now understood what Seamus Callahan had understood in November of 1903 when he stood on the upper ridge and looked at the blue face, and what Thomas Callahan had understood in the general way of a man keeping faith with something he couldn't fully articulate but refused to betray. The companies had looked at this ridge and seen nothing they knew how to sell. Seamus had said that was their problem, not his. He had been right for 120 years, and he was still right now. The white mineral deposits on the rocks beside the seeps. Seamus had noticed them in 1888, had sent samples to a chemist in Frankfurt, and received back a report identifying an alkaline mineral of unknown commercial application. Had documented their location and concentration across 30 years of careful survey work and stored that documentation in a sealed trunk in a stone chamber beneath a spring house on the northeast ridge of Callahan Hollow, waiting for a century that would understand what he had found. There's more, Clara said. She had found a letter of intent, filed as an exhibit in a separate regulatory proceeding, between Consolidated Resources and a company called Meridian Battery Holdings, a tech consortium that manufactured lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles and had been seeking a domestic lithium supplier for 3 years. The letter of intent was contingent on Consolidated Resources obtaining the full mineral extraction license, which was contingent on controlling the full mineral rights across the ridge system. which was contingent on acquiring the Callahan claims. The Meridian deal is worth approximately $280 million to Consolidated Resources over 10 years, in addition to the direct extraction revenue, Clara said. Without your claims, the deal doesn't close. Without the deal, they can't service the debt they've taken on to acquire the surrounding parcels. They've been buying surface rights across this ridge for 15 years in preparation for a deal that requires one piece of land they've never been able to buy. That piece is yours. Nora looked at Seamus's compass on the table. The fixed needle pointed at the same bearing it had pointed at since a watchmaker in Harlan had set it in 1905. Patient. Exact. What about Silas Pruitt? She said. That, Clara said, is the part that explains the timeline. She had found a payment record in the corporate filings of a Consolidated Resources subsidiary company called Appalachian Land Services LLC, showing a $40,000 consulting payment to Pruitt's law firm, dated 2 weeks before Thomas Callahan died. A second payment of $15,000 had been made 3 months after the estate was filed. The nature of the consulting work was described in the filing as Estate Administration Advisory Services, which was not a category of legal work that had any standard meaning. What it meant, in practical terms, was that Pruitt had been paid to manage Thomas's estate in a manner favorable to Consolidated Resources acquisition goals. He had delayed the estate administration, kept the property in limbo, and done his best to present the property to the heir, whoever that turned out to be, as a worthless burden best exchanged for cash. When Nora had arrived and shown interest rather than taking the buyout, the payments to Consolidated Resources had presumably included a report. I'm filing a complaint with the Kentucky Bar Association this afternoon, Clara said. And I'm sending Consolidated Resources a formal notice of your mineral rights ownership by certified mail today, which establishes the record date. Any extraction license application they have pending is now contingent on resolving your claims, and I'll be filing an intervention with the DNR to ensure the state is aware of the ownership dispute before any license is granted. She paused. We need to move fast. The public comment period on their extraction license application closes in 52 days. If we can get a quiet title action filed before then, establishing your ownership on record, we can block the license until the matter is adjudicated. Nora wrote down the dates and the actions and the names. Then she asked the question that had been sitting at the back of her mind since the moment Cole had pulled up the lane. Do you think they'll stop at offers? Clara's answer came without hesitation, in the voice of someone who had been in this position before and had no illusions about the nature of companies that had spent 15 years and millions of dollars building toward a $420 million deal. No, she said. I don't. Document everything. Don't go anywhere alone on that ridge. And if anything changes at the property, call me immediately. Nora returned from a supply run into Harlan 2 days later and knew, before she reached the back door, that someone had been in the house. She had developed this particular attentiveness over years of living in shared spaces where the only privacy available was what you actively maintained an awareness of the small details of any space she occupied, the precise placement of objects she handled regularly, the angle of a door she pulled closed. She wasn't paranoid. She was specific, which was different. Paranoia worried about things that might happen. Specificity noticed things that had already happened and worked backward from the evidence. The compass tin was on the kitchen shelf at a slightly different angle than she had left it. Not a large difference, perhaps 10 degrees of rotation, but she had placed it with its long axis parallel to the edge of the shelf, and it was now diagonal to the edge by a margin she could see clearly. The attic door, which she left fully closed and had tested when she left that morning, was not quite latched. And Thomas's letter, which she had replaced in its envelope on the shelf after the first reading, was in the envelope, but folded along a different crease axis. The paper remembered its previous folds, and the new fold lines ran at an angle to the old ones. Nothing was missing. Nothing was damaged. Whoever had come with care and purpose and the specific intention of reading without disturbing, which was a kind of professional restraint that was, in its own way, more unsettling than a ransacked room. A ransacked room was someone in a panic. This was someone in control. Someone who knew what they were looking for and had found it and left without needing to take anything, because taking it would have told her what they'd done. She stood in the kitchen for a full minute without moving, letting the implications settle into a clear shape. Then she called Clara and reported the entry with the same level tone she used when she was describing a structural problem to a property manager's specific details. No alarm, just what was there and what it meant. Clara said to document it, and to move the most important materials off the property as a precaution. That evening, Nora carried Seamus's journals and the geological survey maps and the gold coins in their bags to Meg's house, where Meg accepted them with the unruffled manner of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment and had already cleared a space in her downstairs cedar chest. Meg asked no questions. She made tea and they sat at her kitchen table for an hour, and Meg talked about Thomas in the last years of his life, how he had seemed, not more peaceful exactly, but more resolved, as if he had finished whatever he had set out to do and was waiting for the next part of the story to begin. Over the following evenings, reading by lantern light at Thomas's table with Meg's casserole keeping warm on the wood stove, Nora worked through Seamus's journals one by one. The first journal, covering 1888 through 1891, was the foundation of everything else. It was a record of his earliest systematic observations of the ridge formation. Written during the same years he was producing survey work for the coal companies, so it had the double quality of professional precision and private excitement. The careful language of someone who had found something unusual and was disciplined enough not to let that excitement compromise the accuracy of what he was recording. He noted the white efflorescence at the seeps. He measured the concentrations at different elevations and found they increased with altitude toward the main ridge line. He collected samples and described their physical properties in careful detail. The third journal, 1895 through 1897, showed the investigation deepening. He had been studying the formation for 7 years by then, long enough to understand its extent. He sketched cross-sections of the ridge with the formations shown in relative thickness and distribution, and his annotations identified the zones of highest mineral concentration with a precision that the Denver consulting firm's modern assessment would later confirm to be remarkably accurate. In one entry, he described taking a sample to a geology professor at the State College in Lexington who examined it and told him it was an unusual limestone carbonate of no current commercial interest. Seamus had written below the professor's verdict, "He is right about current. He cannot know about future." The fifth journal was the most striking. It covered 1901 through 1904, the years of the legal fight, and it showed a man conducting his most rigorous scientific work while simultaneously defending his right to the ground it concerned. The entries alternated between terse records of court dates and legal maneuvers and dense, meticulous geological observations, as if the threat of losing the claims had made him sharpen his documentation to the point of perfection. He described the main brine deposit in terms that aligned precisely with the language in the Consolidated Resources Geological Assessment, using different words for the same geological features. He mapped the subsurface channels he inferred from the surface seep patterns. He noted the correlation between the surface efflorescence and the depth of the karst dissolution features he could observe in the ridge face exposures. He wrote about the people in Harlan County who dismissed the ridge formations as worthless, the company geologists, the county assessors, even the professor in Lexington, with the patience of someone who was used to being dismissed and had learned that patience and documentation were the only adequate responses to that kind of dismissal. One entry read, "They look at this formation and see nothing. I have surveyed this ridge for 15 years, and I have never once seen nothing. What they mean is that they see nothing they already know how to sell. That is a different problem entirely, and it is their problem, not mine." There was something in that entry, in the directness of the logic and the calm of the delivery, that reminded Nora of how she had felt sitting in Patrice Holt's office with the thin county folder in her hands. The difference between being told something had no value and actually having no value. The difference between someone else's framework for what mattered and the simpler fact of what was actually there. And in an entry from November of 1903, written in a hand slightly more urgent than his usual measured style, he described spending a full day on the upper ridge above the hollow and finding a place where the limestone face was exposed in a vertical section 20 feet high and 40 feet wide, where the mineral staining was so heavy and so concentrated that the rock itself appeared to be a different color from the surrounding formation. He called it the blue face. He marked it on his survey with a specific symbol, the same symbol she had seen on the geological maps from the trunk, and he wrote beneath the entry, "This is the heart of it." Everything I have filed. Everything I have documented. It is all to protect access to this place. The small tin tube she had brought back from Point B still sat sealed on the kitchen shelf. Seamus had told her in the letter that C was the proof. She understood now what he meant, and she understood that what she would find at C was not another collection of documentation, but the physical evidence itself, the geological feature he had spent 30 years protecting, the place where the mineral deposit was most concentrated and most visible. The location that would make the Consolidated Resources Geological Assessment not a proprietary document that she needed experts to interpret, but something she could stand in front of and see with her own eyes. She picked up the small tin tube from the shelf and worked the solder at one in the same way she had opened the first one. 10 careful minutes, the old metal giving way without forcing. Inside was a single sheet of paper, rolled tight, wrapped in oilcloth. She unrolled it on the table. It was the complement to the first map fragment. She could see immediately how the two pieces would join, the creek line matching, the ridge contour continuing, the notations in the same hand. The combined map showed the full trail from A to B to C, and C was marked not with a letter alone, but with the geological symbol for a mineral exposure. A small star-shaped notation with a dot at the center, the kind of marking that appeared in survey documents to identify a significant surface outcrop. C was approximately 600 feet above B, on the upper face of the ridge, at the location Seamus had described in the fifth journal as the blue face. And below the map, in Seamus's hand, written in the darker ink of the later editions, one sentence. C is the proof. Everything else is the introduction. Nora set the map down on the table and placed the two fragments side by side and looked at the complete trail laid out from beginning to end. The morning she had arrived at the lane's mouth with 2 duffel bags and $312 and a county court document she hadn't understood. The standing stone, the spring house, the trunk, the journals. 120 years of a man's careful work waiting to be read by someone who would understand what it was worth. Outside, the night had settled into the particular quiet of the hollow in the last of September, the creek still running. The trees past their loudest weeks, the season composing itself for what was coming. Clara had said 52 days on the comment period. Cole had parked at the bottom of the lane for 42 minutes. Someone had been through the house, reading Thomas's letter, measuring the shape of what Nora knew and hadn't yet acted on. In the morning, she would go up the ridge to the blue face. She would bring her phone, and she would photograph every inch of what Seamus had spent 30 years documenting and protecting, the physical evidence that made all the filings and journals and survey maps into something a person could stand in front of and understand without needing a geologist to translate it. She would send the photographs to Clara before she came back down. And then she would sit at Thomas's table and read the second map fragment one more time and understand, finally, the complete shape of what Seamus Callahan had built across 120 years of patience and stone and careful legal work, not just for himself, but for whoever came after him, for the one who would need it badly enough to find it. She had 40 acres and a dead man's mineral claims and a sealed chamber full of a century-old surveyor's records and a lawyer in Lexington who was moving fast. She had 287 gold coins at Meg's house in a cedar chest and 6 journals that described the most significant mineral deposit in Harlan County in plain, careful language that no court in the state could dismiss. She thought about Silas Pruitt and the $40,000 payment 2 weeks before Thomas died. She thought about Brecken Cole's 42 minutes at the bottom of the lane. She thought about a company that had spent 15 years and millions of dollars acquiring 2,890 acres of surrounding surface rights in preparation for a deal that required one piece of land they had never been able to buy, and about the fact that the person now standing between them and $420 million was a 22-year-old woman who had arrived 6 days ago with $312 and 2 duffel bags and no particular reason to believe that the world was going to offer her anything it hadn't already declined to offer. She thought about what Seamus had written in the 5th journal during the worst years of the legal fight, when the company lawyers were filing motions and men were coming to his fence at night, and the outcome was genuinely uncertain. They look at this formation and see nothing. What they mean is that they see nothing they already know how to sell. That is their problem, not mine. She was not her mother, who had died at 28 with no foundation under her. She was not the child in a county folder, unnamed except by her case number, assigned to placements and discharged from them according to the administrative calendar of a system that meant well and provided nothing. She was Nora Margaret Callahan, direct heir to Seamus Callahan of County Clare, and the land under the ridge above this hollow had been held in her name by a chain of carefully maintained legal filings since 1888. She was not going to sign anything over to anybody. She picked up Seamus's compass from the table, felt the cool brass settle into her palm, and set it by the window where the morning light would find it first. The fixed needle pointed at its single bearing in the dark, the same bearing it had held for 120 years, patient and exact, and entirely uninterested in the passage of time or the opinions of anyone who had looked at this ridge and decided it was worthless. She went asleep. She left before dawn with the compass in her jacket pocket and the second map fragment in the same Ziploc bag she had used for the first one. The hollow was still dark when she crossed the pasture, the eastern ridge outlined against a sky that had gone from black to the particular deep blue that comes in the last half hour before sunrise, the color of something that has decided to change but hasn't finished deciding. The morning before she left, she had sat at Thomas's table for 20 minutes with Seamus's sixth journal open to the final pages, reading the last entries again. He had written the last one in 1908, 3 years after fixing the compass needle, 2 years into the period when the legal fight was settled and the trail was built, and all that remained was to wait. The entry was brief by his standards, less than a page, a record of his inspection of the trail's 4 points in sequence, confirming that everything was where it was supposed to be and that the solder on the tubes was sound and the stone at the standing stone closed cleanly. He wrote, "All is in order. The rest belongs to time." She had set the journal down and thought about what it required of a person to build something intended to outlast them and then entrust it entirely to time. No control over how long. No control over who. Just the work, correctly done, and the faith that correctly done work finds its way to correctly done outcomes eventually, if the documentation is sound and the law is followed and the land is held. She had crossed the pasture in the dark thinking about that. She followed the path to the spring house from memory now, the route fixed in her after the previous climbs the way routes fixed themselves once you had walked them in both directions with your full attention. Through the wood lot, along the drainage ravine, up the bench of land to the roofless stone walls where Seamus had built his spring house over the strongest seep on the ridge. She climbed past it without stopping, following the second map fragment's dotted line, which ran northeast and upward from B in a direction she had studied well enough to trust her sense of it, without holding the map in front of her every step. The climb above the spring house was steeper and rougher than the lower slope. The hardwood canopy thinned as she gained elevation, the trees smaller and more wind-shaped, the exposed rock more frequent. She moved through bands of outcropping limestone, pale and porous, the karst topography Seamus had spent 30 years documenting opening up around her in the broken, irregular way of rock that groundwater had been working on for a very long time. At the seeps here, and there were more of them, emerging from cracks in the exposed faces at intervals of 10 or 20 feet, the white crystalline deposits were heavier than the ones lower on the ridge. Thicker, more concentrated, the color more pronounced, with a faint grayish-blue tint at the edges where a different mineral compound was co-precipitating out of solution alongside the carbonate. She photographed each seep as she passed them, noting the GPS coordinates automatically saved with each image, building a documented record of what the formation looked like at every elevation from the hollow floor to the ridge face above. She found the blue face at 7:43 in the morning, in full daylight, 40 minutes after leaving the spring house. It was larger than she had formed in her mind from Seamus's description. 20 feet high was what he had written, and 20 feet was accurate, but the vertical exposure extended further horizontally than his estimate, closer to 60 feet than 40, a broad sweep of limestone face where the ridge broke into a near-vertical section before angling back to the upper slope. The mineral staining was unmistakable and immediate. Where the surrounding rock was the pale tint she had seen everywhere on the ridge, this section was distinctly different in color, a blue-gray tonality that ran through the joints and bedding planes of the formation in patterns that were clearly structural, following the lines of the rock's internal architecture rather than anything random. At the base of the face, where the slope flattened briefly and the runoff collected before moving downhill, The crystalline deposits were dense enough to form a visible white crust across the ground, inches thick in places, catching the morning light and returning it with a faint, alkaline brightness that she recognized from the photographs she had studied, from Seamus's descriptions in the Fifth Journal, from the Consolidated Resources Geological Assessments, careful clinical language about the lithium-bearing brine system active in the Pennsylvanian limestone formation above Callahan Hollow. She stood in front of it for a while, without photographing anything. She stood there and looked at it as Seamus must have stood here in November of 1903, in the middle of his legal fight, when the outcome was genuinely uncertain and the company lawyers were filing motions and men had already come to his fence twice in the dark. He had stood here and understood that this was the reason. Not the filings, not the court rulings, not the money that hadn't arrived yet in any form and might not arrive for generations. Those were the necessary instruments of a larger purpose. The thing itself, the thing that the instruments existed to protect, was here. Blue-gray mineral stain in the limestone joints, white crystalline accumulation at the base, the slow patient work of a geological system cycling mineral-rich water through ancient rock for longer than any human ambition could usefully imagine. The companies had surveyed this ridge for a century and seen nothing worth noting. Seamus had looked at this formation for 30 years and known that the failure to see value in something was not the same as the absence of value, and that patience and documentation were the correct response to that kind of institutional blindness. He had been right in a way that exceeded anything he could have calculated, because in 1903 nobody on Earth had any particular reason to prize lithium. The EV battery was not a concept that existed. The specific demand that would make this formation worth $420 million was a century away. He had protected it anyway, on the principle that the Earth didn't produce anomalies without reason, and that careful observation was more reliable than any current framework for understanding what a thing was worth. She started photographing. She worked for an hour, systematic and thorough, moving along the face from one end to the other, documenting every feature at multiple distances and from multiple angles. Close-ups of the mineral staining in the joint patterns. Wide shots showing the full extent of the exposure. Mid-range shots that captured the relationship between the crystalline deposits at the base and the stained rock above. She took 37 photographs, each one GPS-tagged and time-stamped, and she sent them to Clara in a batch with a message that said, "The blue face. Point C. I'm standing in front of it right now." Clara's response came 12 minutes later, which was fast enough to suggest she had been waiting. She wrote, "I'm forwarding these to the geological consultant I've retained. He'll have a preliminary assessment within 48 hours. More importantly, these photographs establish your physical presence on the formation and are consistent with the geological description in the Consolidated Resources Assessment filed with the DNR. Hold your position. We file tomorrow." At the very base of the limestone face, half concealed by years of crystalline accumulation that had built up around it, Nora found what she had not expected but perhaps should have. A small brass disc, about 2 inches across, set flush into the rock face with lead anchors driven into a drilled hole. The disc was tarnished dark, but the inscription on its face was legible under her fingers before her eyes confirmed what she was reading. S.C. 1903. The same initials as the compass. The same year as the journal entry. Seamus Callahan had marked this place, not with anything that a company surveyor passing through would recognize as a claim marker, because it was too small and too low for that. It was set at knee height, below the line of easy observation, the kind of mark you only found if you were looking for it. He had put his initials on the heart of the thing he had spent 30 years protecting, and then he had built a trail to lead the right person to it. And then he had gone back to his legal fighting and his careful documentation and his refusal to be moved. She photographed the marker and sent it to Clara with a separate message. He marked it. 1903. Clara's reply was 2 words. Of course he did. 3 days after Nora's photographs went to Clara, Consolidated Resources filed a quiet title action in the Harlan County Circuit Court. The action claimed that the Callahan mineral filings had lapsed through failure to record any active claim or use within the relevant statutory period, and that the 2015 restructuring of the company that had held the adjacent surface rights had extinguished any dormant mineral interests through proper legal notice. The filing ran to 40 pages and cited 17 precedents, and it was signed by a partner at a Louisville law firm whose website listed 11 attorneys and offices in 3 cities. Clara had anticipated it. She had filed Nora's own quiet title action 2 days before Consolidated Resources filed theirs, establishing the record date of Nora's ownership claim prior to any challenge. She had also filed a petition for a temporary restraining order against the DNR extraction license application, citing the ongoing ownership dispute as grounds to freeze the proceeding. The restraining order was granted within 24 hours. When Nora called to ask what this meant in practical terms, Clara said, "It means they can't move forward on the extraction license until the court resolves who owns the mineral rights. And the Meridian Battery letter of intent has a deadline. If the deal doesn't close before that deadline, the agreement lapses and Consolidated Resources loses the contract." How much time do they have? 41 days from tomorrow. Nora was silent for a moment, calculating. So they're going to fight very hard for the next 41 days, she said. Yes, Clara said. They are. Cole came back on a Thursday, 8 days into the litigation. It was a different kind of visit from the first one. The practiced friendliness was still there, but the timing and the directness had changed. He knocked, she opened the door, and he came to his point within 2 minutes rather than 10. "We'd like to make you a serious offer," he said. "Not the $12,000 the attorney presented at the outset, and not the $200,000 from my previous visit. We understand the situation has changed, and we want to reflect that." He paused, and the pause was shorter than his previous pauses, less composed. $5 million. Cash, 30 days, taxes on us, legal fees covered, clean transfer of the mineral rights. It was more money than Nora had ever seen or expected to see in any version of her life she had imagined before September. She felt its weight for exactly 1 beat, the way she felt the weight of the gold coins before setting them down. And then she looked at Cole and said, "No." Cole held his expression with visible effort. He was a man who was accustomed to large numbers moving people, and the absence of movement was clearly registering as unexpected data he had to process in real time. He tried a different approach, his voice dropping into something more confidential, more collegial, the tone of one reasonable person talking to another about a problem they both had in common. "I want to be honest with you about where we are," he said. "We have a significant transaction pending that depends on resolving this matter. My board is under pressure. The offer I just made you reflects that pressure, which means it's a number you won't see in ordinary circumstances. In 60 days, if this isn't resolved, the transaction lapses and the number changes significantly." He looked at her with the expression of someone sharing privileged information. "I'm not trying to intimidate you. I'm trying to give you accurate information so you can make a real decision." Nora looked at him. She thought about Seamus writing in the 5th journal. They look at this formation and see nothing. What they mean is that they see nothing they already know how to sell. That is their problem, not mine. She thought about Thomas sitting in this kitchen saying no to smaller amounts of the same fundamental offer for 32 years, across the same kitchen table, in the same chair she was currently not sitting in because she was standing in her own doorway. "I understand," she said. "The answer is no." Cole looked at her for a moment with what appeared to be genuine puzzlement, the look of a person encountering a category they don't have a good framework for. Then the puzzlement passed, and the professional surface reassembled itself. "We'll see you in court," he said. "Yes," she said. "You will." She closed the door and stood in the kitchen for a minute, her hands steady, and then she called Clara and told her about the $5 million offer. Clara said, "Good. They're scared and offering above their floor. We go to court." The hearing in Harlan County Circuit Court was set for 3 weeks out, in a courtroom on the 2nd floor of the same courthouse where Earl Dunmore had spent 31 years keeping the record straight. Clara drove down from Lexington the day before and spent the evening at the farmhouse going through the exhibits with Nora at Thomas's table. The 18 original filings and certified copies, the chain of inheritance documentation from Seamus to Cathal to the subsequent generations to Thomas's properly probated will, and the geological consultant's preliminary assessment confirming that Nora's photographs of the blue face were consistent with the formation described in the Consolidated Resources DNR filing. The strongest exhibit was the simplest. A single-page document showing Silas Pruitt's law firm had received $40,000 from an Appalachian Land Services LLC subsidiary account on a date 2 weeks before Thomas Callahan died. and $15,000 more 3 months after the estate was filed. Clara had obtained it through a corporate filing database. The record of a business transaction that Consolidated Resources had never anticipated would need to be explained in a Kentucky courtroom. She had also obtained Pruitt's phone records from the estate proceeding period, which showed 11 calls between Pruitt's cell phone and a number registered to Brecken Cole's corporate account in the 18 months the estate had been pending. We introduce this not to argue that Thomas was harmed, Clara told Nora, but to establish that the party contesting your ownership has a documented pattern of bad faith conduct related to this exact property and this exact estate. It goes to their credibility as a litigant. The hearing ran for 6 hours across 2 days. Nora sat at the plaintiff's table beside Clara and said nothing except when the judge addressed her directly, which happened twice. Once when she was asked to confirm her identity and her relationship to the estate, and once during a brief recess when the judge, a woman in her 60s who had been on the Harlan County bench for 22 years and had the steady bearing of someone who had processed most of what there was to process and was not easily redirected, walked past the table and looked at the original brass compass that Nora had placed beside her legal pad, the one artifact she had brought from the farmhouse that morning without being entirely sure why, and said, "Is that from the property?" "Yes, Your Honor," Nora said. "It belonged to the original claimant, Seamus Callahan." The judge looked at the compass for a moment. 1882 through 1921, she said, which meant she had already read the filing history thoroughly enough to know the dates. Then she moved on to the bench without further comment. Consolidated Resources Louisville attorneys argued the statutory abandonment provisions, the 2015 restructuring notice, the company's long-standing presence on the adjacent parcels, and the commercial complexity that an adverse ruling would create for a legitimate business operation that had invested heavily in good faith. Their expert witness, a University of Louisville law professor, testified at length about the legal framework for dormant mineral interests and the conditions under which they could be deemed to have lapsed. He was authoritative and fluent, and his testimony filled 2 hours of court time without a visible gap. Clara cross-examined him for 45 minutes. Calmly and specifically, using the exact language of the Kentucky statutory text to show that every condition the expert cited as grounds for lapse was absent from the Callahan claims. The filings had never been declared dormant. The surface owner had continuously paid taxes on the 40-acre parcel, and the statutory notice requirement for the 2015 restructuring had explicitly required personal notification to all registered shareholders and claimants of record, which Consolidated Resources had not provided. The cross-examination didn't attack the expert's knowledge. It used his knowledge against his conclusions, the way you used a detailed survey to show that the boundary line had been drawn in the wrong place. She introduced the Pruitt payments on the second day, and the Louisville attorneys objected on relevance grounds. The judge overruled the objection and read the document carefully before setting it down. Her expression during the reading was the same as it had been for everything else, entirely composed, entirely attentive, giving nothing away about where it was going. The ruling came 4 days after the hearing, delivered by written order filed on a Wednesday morning. It was 14 pages, and Clara read it to Nora by phone, her voice moving through the legal language at a pace that allowed the substance to accumulate properly. The court found that the Callahan mineral claims were valid, properly filed, and properly inherited. That the chain of title was unbroken from Seamus Callahan to Nora Margaret Callahan. That the 2015 restructuring notice had not satisfied the statutory requirement for personal notification to claimants of record, and therefore the attempted abandonment had no legal effect. That the mineral rights were not subject to any lapse, dormancy, or termination. And that Nora Margaret Callahan was the sole legal owner of the mineral rights described in the 18 filings dated 1888 through 1916 across approximately 3,040 acres of Harlan County ridgeland. The last paragraph of the ruling, the one Clara read twice, addressed the Pruitt payments. The court found that the documented relationship between the challenging party's corporate affiliate and the attorney who had administered the estate constituted a conflict of interest that would be referred to the Kentucky Bar Association for review. It was careful language, judicial language, the kind that said everything necessary without saying more than it needed to. Nora was sitting at Thomas's table when Clara finished reading. Outside the window, the backfield had gone gold with the last of October, the hardwoods on the ridge turning fast now, red and yellow and orange in the cold, clear air. She stayed sitting for a long time, looking at the field and the ridge above it, without feeling what she might have expected to feel. Not triumph. Not relief exactly, though relief was somewhere in it. Something more like the specific quality of a thing that has been correctly resolved, the satisfaction of a structural calculation that comes out right, where the numbers balance because the load analysis was accurate and the materials were correctly specified and the design was sound. A feeling that was less about winning and more about the experience of being in a situation where the facts, correctly documented and correctly argued, had led to the correct conclusion. She thought about Thomas Callahan sitting in this chair 32 years ago, the first time Consolidated Resources had come to his door. She thought about him reading a letter, or answering a phone call, or speaking to a man on his porch, and saying no in his quiet and complete way, and then returning to this table, and this window, and this view of the ridge, carrying the weight of a responsibility he had accepted without being offered a choice, and had honored without receiving any recognition for it for the rest of his life. "We won," Nora said. "You won," Clara said. "Now let's make sure you're compensated appropriately." Consolidated Resources appealed within 10 days, which was expected and had been planned for. The appeal automatically stayed the lower court's order for 60 days while the appellate court scheduled a hearing. But the Meridian Battery deadline was now 22 days away, and an appeal that would take months to resolve was a contract expiration that Consolidated Resources could not wait out. The Meridian Battery agreement had been structured with a hard close date, and a mineral rights ownership dispute actively in appellate litigation was exactly the kind of unresolved encumbrance that made a hard close date a fiction. Meridian's attorneys had made this clear in their own regulatory correspondence, which Clara had obtained through the DNR proceeding record. Any extraction license subject to a contested ownership claim was not a foundation on which a $280 million supply contract could close. Consolidated Resources had spent 15 years and most of their available operating capital acquiring the surrounding parcels, commissioning the geological assessment, and preparing the Meridian deal. Everything depended on one piece of land they had never been able to buy, and the person who owned it had said no at $12,000, no at $200,000, and no at $5 million. They called Clara on a Tuesday morning. They wanted to talk settlement. The negotiation took 3 sessions over 2 weeks, conducted by video call between Clara's Lexington office and the Louisville firm. Nora sat in on every session, said almost nothing, listened to everything, and made her decisions between calls at Thomas's table, while Meg sat across from her with coffee and the patience of someone who had been waiting for a long time already and had enough patience left. The opening offer from Consolidated Resources was $80 million for the full mineral rights, structured as a buyout. Clara countered at $190 million. The Louisville attorneys expressed surprise at the counter in measured, professional language that was designed to suggest the number was unreasonable without saying so directly. Clara explained, methodically and without apparent emotion, the basis for the figure, the geological assessment's own projected extraction value, the royalty structure that would apply to Consolidated Resources' Meridian Battery contract, the cost savings they would realize from resolving the ownership dispute before the deadline expired, and the exposure they faced if the quiet title ruling was upheld on appeal. She put each figure on a shared screen and walked through the arithmetic the way an engineer walked through a load calculation. Here are the inputs. Here is the methodology. Here is the result. The second session moved the numbers to $95 million against $175 million, and the atmosphere on the call changed. The Louisville attorneys were more subdued, consulting privately between themselves for longer intervals before responding, which Clara told Nora afterward meant they were up against a deadline they had not fully communicated to the Louisville firm and were recalibrating. The Meridian Battery contract expiration was now 16 days away. Clara told Nora privately that she expected the final number to land between $120 and $140 million, which was consistent with the geological assessment's valuation minus a discount for the extraction timeline risk. But Nora had been doing her own thinking. She had spent the week between the second and third sessions going through Seamus's 6th journal, the last one, the 1905 through 1908 volume, and reading his description of the trail he had built and the reasons he had built it. He wrote about it with a practical clarity that made it feel less like a gesture of hope and more like an engineering decision. He had built a system that required specific knowledge and specific effort to follow, not because he distrusted his heirs, but because he trusted the selection process. Only the right person would follow it all the way through. Desperate enough to search, patient enough to proceed, careful enough to read what was actually there rather than what they wished to find. She told Clara she wanted something different from a straight buyout. She wanted $110 million in cash for 60% of the mineral rights, with the remaining 40% structured as a royalty interest, meaning Consolidated Resources would pay her a percentage of revenue from extraction operations for the life of the deposit, which the geological assessment projected at 25 years. At current lithium prices, that royalty stream was worth an additional $60 to $80 million over the life of the contract, though the actual number would depend on the market. She also wanted three things that had nothing to do with money. A community benefit agreement requiring Consolidated Resources to prioritize local hiring from Harlan County for at least 60% of the extraction operations workforce for the first 10 years, and to fund a $3 million endowment at the Harlan County school system designated for students in foster care. Environmental standards for the brine extraction process that exceeded the minimum required by state and federal regulation, specifically addressing the management of extracted brine fluids to prevent groundwater contamination in the hollow below the deposit. And a formal geological designation for the formation, recorded with the Kentucky Geological Survey and referenced in all public documentation related to the deposit, identifying it as the Seamus Callahan deposit. A permanent name. A permanent record. Consolidated Resources agreed. The money took 2 rounds of counter-offer before landing where Clara had predicted it would. $112 million in cash for the 60% interest, royalties on the remaining 40%, the community benefit agreement, the environmental standards, and the naming designation. The Meridian Battery deal closed 11 days later, with the Seamus Callahan deposit cited in the extraction license application as the geological source of the lithium supply Meridian needed. Clara's contingency fee was 25% of the $112 million cash component, $28 million. Federal and state taxes on the remainder consumed approximately $33 million. Nora's net from the cash settlement was just over $51 million, with the royalty income beginning the following year at an initial rate that the extraction company projected at $2.1 million annually for the first decade. The back taxes on the Callahan property $4,200, the number that had been the frame of her entire situation 6 weeks ago, the number that had determined whether the lane with the rusted mailbox led anywhere at all, were the first thing she paid. She walked into the Harlan County tax office with a money order, the old-fashioned kind, and paid the clerk directly. The clerk stamped the record paid and handed her the receipt, and Nora put the receipt in her jacket pocket and walked back out into the October afternoon without making anything of it. The contrast between where she had started and where she had arrived was not something she needed to perform for anyone. The receipt was enough. The record was correct. That was what mattered. Silas Pruitt surrendered his law license to the Kentucky Bar Association 5 weeks after the court ruling, submitting a voluntary resignation in lieu of facing the disciplinary proceeding that Clara's referral had initiated. The bar accepted the resignation and closed the file. It was not the outcome Nora would have chosen if the choice were hers, but Clara explained that voluntary surrender was often the practical ceiling in cases where the conduct hadn't crossed into criminal territory, and that the loss of a law license was a substantial consequence for a man who had spent 30 years building a practice around it. Nora accepted this with the same equanimity she applied to most things that couldn't be altered once they were settled, which was to say she accepted it, filed it, and moved on. Brecken Cole was reassigned within Consolidated Resources to a role with no external-facing responsibilities, which was the corporate equivalent of a verdict delivered without ceremony or appeal. The Louisville attorneys filed a client engagement termination notice with the court and did not return calls from the company after that. The Meridian Battery deal closed on the revised terms 11 days after the settlement, with Nora's royalty rights properly documented in the extraction license, and the Seamus Callahan deposit named in the public geological record by designation of the Kentucky Geological Survey. The name would appear in every regulatory filing, every environmental report, every industry document about the deposit for as long as the deposit existed. A County Clare immigrant who had died in 1921 with almost nothing visible to show for a lifetime of careful, patient work would have his name on the most significant lithium deposit in eastern Kentucky for as long as it mattered. Nora thought he would have considered that a fair outcome. Earl Dunmore retired from the Harlan County Land Records Office the following spring, after 32 years. Nora mailed him a handwritten card and a bottle of Pappy Van Winkle bourbon and a note that said, "Thank you for 31 years of keeping the record straight." For 32, actually. She had counted wrong the first time. Earl wrote back a single sentence on a piece of county office stationery. Those records were always right. Someone just needed to read them. Meg's daughter's family had been trying for 3 years to expand the farmhouse on the adjacent property to accommodate Meg's aging needs without moving her from the hollow she had lived in for 50 years. The renovation had stalled for lack of funds. Nora paid for it without being asked, commissioning a contractor from Harlan who employed 3 people from the county and completed the work in 6 weeks. Meg said nothing about it directly. She showed her gratitude by continuing to bring food to the farmhouse at unpredictable intervals and by never, in any subsequent conversation, treating Nora as anything other than exactly who she had been the morning she walked up the lane with 2 duffel bags and a cardboard box. Nora found this to be among the better gifts she had received, because it meant Meg had understood from the beginning that the person who arrived was the same person who had always been there, and that the money had not created her, but simply given her room. Nora established the Seamus Callahan Fund through the Community Foundation of Eastern Kentucky, endowing it with $4 million and structuring its purpose specifically around children in the foster care system in Harlan, Bell, and Letcher counties, the 3 systems she had moved through herself. The fund provided scholarship support for higher education and vocational training, stipends for professional certification programs that the community college system offered, but that most foster youth couldn't afford to complete, and an emergency assistance program for young adults aging out of care who needed first month's rent or a security deposit or a winter coat. The specific gaps that fell between state support and actual self-sufficiency. The gaps she had spent her first 22 years navigating with the resources she happened to have on a given day. She staffed it carefully. A former foster youth from Bell County who had become a social worker. A high school counselor from Harlan who had been quietly advocating for foster students for 20 years, getting them college application fee waivers and writing them recommendation letters and showing up to meetings on their behalf, even when nobody asked him to. A financial administrator who charged rates appropriate to a small nonprofit rather than rates designed for foundations that could absorb them. She built the board's legal structure to prevent the fund's purpose from drifting documentation, restrictions, terms clear enough that no future board could quietly redirect the resources towards something easier or more prestigious. The same instinct Seamus had brought to his mineral claim filings. Don't leave gaps. She named it for Thomas because Thomas had held the line. Not because he had fully understood what he was holding, but because he had held it anyway, for 32 years, on the bare principle that it was his to hold, and that the people who wanted it too badly for the wanting itself not to be information. In the fund's first year of operation, 53 applications came in from young people in the 3-county area who needed what the fund offered. Nora read every one of them personally, which the fund's administrative coordinator had not expected and had not tried to discourage. She read them in the evenings at Thomas's table, the applications spread across the walnut surface the way the journals had been spread there in October, each one a document in a different kind of record, a body of evidence about what the gap between state care and independent living actually looked like from the inside. A 20-year-old from Bell County who needed $800 for a security deposit on an apartment so she could stop sleeping in her car. A 19-year-old from Harlan who had been accepted to the community college nursing program but couldn't pay the lab fees. A 23-year-old who had aged out at 18, worked 3 jobs, and needed 2 semesters of tuition to finish a welding certification that would triple his income. The fund approved 41 of the 53 in the first year. The 12 rejections were not rejections of the people, but of applications that needed more documentation or different types of support than the fund structure could provide, and the coordinator followed up with each one with referrals to other resources. Nora did not consider this to be charity. She considered it to be what the money was for, which was different. The money had been created by 140 years of patient documentation and refusal to sell. It had passed through 6 generations of people who had held it without knowing what it was. It had arrived in the hands of someone who had needed it badly enough to find it. The use that kept faith with that history was the use that turned it outward, that put it in the service of the specific kind of need that the history had been shaped by. That was not a charitable impulse. That was simply the correct allocation of a resource that had been carefully protected until the right moment. She enrolled at the University of Kentucky in the fall semester, in the civil engineering program, living in a small apartment in Lexington during the week and coming back to the farmhouse on weekends throughout the first year. The farmhouse was being renovated during the same months, not transformed into something it wasn't, but properly repaired, made structurally sound in the ways that age and limited resources had prevented Thomas from maintaining. New window frames, a rebuilt chimney crown, a properly insulated attic floor, which meant the attic room where she had found the tin was now accessible year-round without freezing. The renovation was done by the same contractor who had worked on Meg's property, a man from Harlan with a crew of 4 who showed up on time and did the work correctly the first time and didn't try to expand the scope. Nora appreciated this on principle. She kept Thomas's walnut table. She kept the compass on the kitchen windowsill where Seamus's fixed needle continued its single-minded pointing at the same bearing it had always pointed at, indifferent to the resolution of all the matters it had set in motion. She kept the 6 journals and the geological maps in the bedroom closet in the trunk she had carried down from the springhouse chamber in 3 trips, the iron fittings now cleaned and oiled, the leather straps replaced. She did not consider these things to be possessions in the way that new things became possessions. They were records, documents in a different form, belonging to the same archive as the 18 filings in the Harlan County Courthouse, part of a continuous body of evidence about what had been here and what it had required to protect it across 140 years of people, mostly men, mostly patient, all of them saying no in their different ways to different versions of the same pressure. The first royalty payment from the extraction operation arrived in March of the following year, $187,000, representing the first quarter of revenue from the initial production wells on the upper ridge. Nora looked at the deposit notification in her banking app and thought about Seamus's first mineral claim filing in 1888, which had cost him 60 cents in county fees, which was what he had had available from his wages that week and not $1 more. The distance between 60 cents and $187,000 in the first quarter of the first year of extraction was not a distance that could be crossed in a single generation. It had required 6 generations of patience, 4 of which had not known what they were being patient about and had simply held the land because Thomas said to and Thomas's grandfather had said to and his grandfather before that had said to. She was 23 years old. She was in her 2nd semester of engineering school, and she had learned in the first 2 months that her instinct for how structures held together and failed was real and trainable and would, in time, produce something professional and useful. She was a property owner and a mineral rights holder and a charitable fund founder. She held none of these identities the way someone would hold them who needed others to know they had them. She held them the way the limestone held the lithium quietly, for reasons the surface didn't reveal, waiting for the right conditions to make them evident. She went back to the blue face in April, on a weekend morning when the hardwood canopy had just started to show the first green of new leaves, the ridge smelling of wet earth, and the particular freshness of mountains in early spring. She climbed without the map fragment, which she no longer needed, and without looking at her phone. She knew the route well enough by then to walk it in her sleep, and she had walked it in her mind so many times in the months since October that the physical act of the climb was a form of memory as much as a form of movement. The blue face was unchanged, as it had always been and would always be. The white crystalline deposits at the base were partially rebuilt after the winter, the freeze-thaw cycles having broken down some of the previous accumulation. But the brine continued seeping and the minerals continued precipitating, and the formation continued its slow geology regardless of what had happened in the Harlan County Circuit Court, or the Kentucky Department of Natural Resources, or the offices of a Lexington attorney who had fought 3 rounds of negotiations over a video call. The mineral staining in the joints was the same dense blue-gray. The brass marker at the base held its position at knee height. S.C. 1903, unaltered by winter or time or the knowledge that the world had finally caught up to understanding what Seamus Callahan had left his mark beside. Nora put her hand against the exposed limestone and held it there. The rock was cold in the spring morning. The way stone was cold when the earth beneath it still carried the memory of winter, and it was solid in the way of things that were genuinely, structurally solid, the kind of solidity that came from being what they were rather than from appearing to be what they were. She could feel, just barely, the faint dampness of the brine seeping slowly through the joint behind her palm. The same seep that had left the same white deposit on the same stone since before anyone in her family line had set foot on this ridge. She took Seamus's compass from her jacket pocket and held it against the face. The needle pointed exactly where it had always pointed 48 degrees, east-northeast, at the fixed bearing a watchmaker had set in 1905 and sealed under glass, and handed back to a man who had stood on this ridge with a surveyor's transit and understood the land in front of him more clearly than any of the company surveyors who had passed through and filed their reports and moved on. She held the compass against the rock for a long moment, the brass warm from her hand, the needle steady. She thought about her mother, Bridget Callahan, who had died in a motel room in Hazard at 28 without knowing that any of this existed, who had been born in this county and had died in this county and had left a 3-year-old daughter on the steps of a group home, without any knowledge that somewhere in the hills above Harlan there was a farmhouse with a walnut table and an attic with a shelf and a tin with a compass on it that was waiting, specifically, for someone in that daughter's exact position. Nora thought about what it would have meant to Bridget to know. She thought about it and she let it hurt for a minute. The way you let a structural stress test run to its limit so you understood where the load-bearing capacity actually was, and then she held the weight of it and stayed standing. She thought about what it meant to inherit something from people who could not give it directly, who had to leave it in stone and legal documents, and the patient custody of those who came between them and you. The $4,200 in back taxes that had been the whole frame of her world 6 weeks before she first walked up the lane. The 2 duffel bags. The rusted mailbox with Callahan hammered into its side. A thin county folder on Patrice Holt's desk with her name on the label. She thought, I was the one who needed it badly enough. I was the one who followed it all the way to the end. The spring light came over the ridge line and touched the blue face, and the white deposits flared briefly bright. The lithium carbonate catching the sun the way Seamus had first noticed it catching the light in 1888, alone on the ridge with his transit and his notebooks. A 24-year-old immigrant who had crossed an ocean because he had a skill and the intention to put it to work in a country where land was being measured fast and claimed faster. He had arrived with $7 and a transit, and he had spent 30 years building a record so complete and so carefully protected that it outlasted not just him, but his children and his grandchildren and the son of his grandchildren, who had lived on this land alone for 3 decades saying no to men who came in good suits with numbers written on paper. She thought about what Seamus had known that the company surveyors had not known. He had known that seeing nothing was not the same as nothing being there. He had known that the measure of a geological formation was not what a given era's technology could extract from it, but what the formation actually contained, which was a fact of nature rather than a fact of economics, and would remain true regardless of what any current framework for valuation said about it. He had known that a mineral rights filing, properly made and properly maintained, was as durable as the rock it described. He had known that the correct response to institutional blindness was not frustration but documentation, and that documentation correctly maintained would eventually find the era that could read it. He had been right. It had taken 120 years and 6 generations and a rusted tin on an attic shelf, but the documentation had found the era that could read it. She was the era. She put the compass back in her pocket and started down the ridge toward the hollow, the farmhouse, the walnut table, and everything that came next. The creek was running loud below her with the spring melt, the sound of it carrying up through the trees in the way that mountain water carried sounds in the morning, clear, specific, persistent, giving nothing up. The same sound it had made every spring for as long as the ridge had been a ridge. The same sound Seamus had heard from this slope in 1888 when he first walked it with a transit and understood that the land in front of him was telling him something, and that the correct response was to listen carefully, document precisely, and keep the faith for as long as the faith required keeping. She was 23 years old. She had $312 in a checking account the morning she arrived in September, and the mountains had not changed to give her more. What they had given her was the record that had been waiting, a record built by a man who understood that the earth held its value regardless of whether anyone could currently extract it, and that the proper instrument for protecting that value across time was not muscle or money but documentation. Legal filings. Survey maps. A sealed trunk in a stone chamber beneath a spring house on the northeast ridge. A compass with a fixed needle and a trail that led, one careful step after another, to the proof. She had been the person the trail was built for. She had arrived in the right circumstances, with the right history, at the right time, not because the world had arranged it as a favor, but because Seamus Callahan had built a system careful enough to find exactly the right person and patient enough to wait for as long as it took. That was the inheritance. Not just the land or the mineral rights or the gold coins or the $420 million worth of lithium in the limestone above the hollow. The inheritance was the understanding that careful work, correctly documented, correctly maintained, correctly entrusted to each generation in sequence, could survive anything. Corporate lawyers. Decades of no. Thin folders on county desks. Time itself. She came out of the trees into the back pasture as the sun cleared the ridge line fully, and the light went from slant to level, flooding the field and the farmhouse and Meg's fence line with the particular clarity of a spring morning when the air is still cold enough to be honest about itself. The walnut table would be where she had left it. The compass would be on the kitchen windowsill. The trunk would be in the bedroom closet with the journals and the maps and Seamus's letter and Thomas's letter and everything that the land had been trying to say for 140 years. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.